What do you want? Who are you?
Who are you?
What?
Who are you? 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 Who are you?
We're going to devote our energies to sports and gardening, all the cultural pursuits as far as they're concerned. In fact, we're going to put the goons to sleep. Meanwhile, we dig.
Greetings and welcome to the Anadromist. This is Burn Power, your host du jour from Tbilisi, Georgia, wherever that is. It's a long way away from wherever you are, most likely. I haven't, actually, I don't think I have many folks from Georgia who are on this particular channel. I do have more on the Georgian Crossroads channel. But anyway, welcome. And today, as promised, I'm going to do the Q&A, the questions and answers that I promised you earlier at the end of last month. And this one is a little different. Rather than taking random questions and answers, or particularly, I didn't want to deal with politics. I'm really tired of it right now, as some of you probably are as well. I do like dealing with meaningful questions, which is mostly what I get, fortunately. But at the same time, I thought I get enough questions about my own life that I thought it would be interesting if I dealt with that. So all of these were questions that you asked in response to my call for questions, specifically of an autobiographical nature. So I'm going to do that. Now I'm going to do something a little different than I normally do. Normally I read a question, then answer it. But since these were autobiographical questions, many of them, of course, overlapped in different ways. So what I'm going to do is read the questions all together at the beginning, and then go through and assemble the whole thing. What I've done is assemble the whole thing as a narrative, as my autobiography, so to speak. However, one thing I won't be doing is answering the questions you didn't ask. Sometimes I will. Sometimes I will mention things you didn't ask, but there are whole swaths of subjects that nobody asked, and I don't feel like making this eternal. So, I mean, I could easily make this. Truthfully, I think on the year 1970 through 1973, I could make hours and hours of video on the subject. Just that alone. So, no, I'm not going into all sorts of details that, like I say, if you didn't ask, I'm not telling, you know. But I was asked some very interesting questions, some very personal, and I said, my thought is, well, why not? I haven't got anything to hide. You know, we all do stupid things. I do stupid things. You do stupid things. So, yeah, let's be stupid together. Okay. So, a woman in London who would like to remain anonymous asked me, she said, I would like to know about your family and early years and siblings and ancestors, etc. Did anyone go through any major tragedies, and family members not spoken about, and maybe any romantic relationships? Oh, gee, that could take the whole time. Fortunately, other people asked similar types of questions. She also asked, what makes you and your life different from a Paul Vanderklay or a Jonathan Pajot, even though your life philosophy is quite similar? To which I would say, we'll get there. Okay, then, Dragan Vujanovic, probably my favorite name of any of my followers here. Just, what is that? Is that Serbian or Croatian or something? What a great name. But anyway, I'd like to hear about your general philosophical quest in life. Regardless of received education in the matter, how did that story evolve up to settling in Georgia? Oh yes, and were you a weird kid? Define weird. Ronito el Destructor Milenario asks, hi Mr. Byrne. People already asked you about the Georgia stuff, so here's a simpler question. Why do you keep watching The Walking Dead? I'm curious about what your opinion about the show is in general. Now, if I get too much into describing The Walking Dead or giving any sort of review about the show, that's no longer autobiographical. But I will mention why I keep watching it later. Let's see. Knight Arnold, as in Sir Knight Arnold. The most important question, how did you end up in Georgia? His was obviously the first question that anybody asked. What else have we got here? Kilgore Trout. There's a fictional reference if I ever heard one. When you were at L'Abri, that's in Switzerland, did you have any contact or recollections of some of the musicians, songwriters who passed through there? Larry Norman, Mark Hurd, etc. And then, okay, let me try to get this correctly. Zank Frappa Wadiesel, that's how he wrote it, asked me, Dear sir, hello, it's me again. Here's my question. Were you always a Christian, and if not, when did you become one and how? And what does it mean to you? Why would you not have become a Muslim, a Buddhist, a Jain, or follow any other of myriad of religions? I myself am a reluctant atheist materialist and can't seem to get myself to subscribe to, believe, any book or creed. You can subscribe to this channel, by the way. As the material universe, hard science seems to make more sense, whereas religious systems seem flawed to me, to say the least. On the other hand, it can feel quite empty on the inside at times, having no sense of a higher something. Regards, Iskander. My real name. Yeah, you would have to. Oh, I see. So he's not Zank Frappa Wadiesel. He's Iskander. Now I get it. Okay. To which I would just briefly say, go listen to my time series sometimes, but we'll end there. But no, I'll answer your question as we go. Dejin said, so here's a question. Ever since you spoke with Pastor Paul Vanderklay last year about various topics of life, I found your life story and pop culture history fascinating. With that said, one of the first things that pop into my head, whatever that means, was, is Mr. Byrne married? Does he have a wife or girlfriend? So, are you, Mr. Byrne, in fact married? You realize my last name is not Byrne. Anyway, people, Byrne is generally a last name, but anyway, if so, how and who? If not, what and why? Okay, yeah, that's a personal question, but I don't mind, and we'll discuss that a little bit. I can't get into names and dates. Related to that, Marianne asked if I ever had children, which she rightly guessed I hadn't, but then she asked if I'd regretted the fact of not having children or ever grieved over it. So we'll cover that as well. Ebb and Flow says, I'm curious that you've managed your social, I'm curious about how you've, he didn't say how, but how you've managed your social life over the years. How do you stay in touch with people you knew in San Francisco, New York, or Alaska? Have you managed those connections when you live so far away? And my answer to that question would be probably the same way you do, which is to say through the internet. But we will discuss that a bit more as we go along. Okay. Ooh, this is a nice one. Okay, you're in the running here for one of the best names on my site, Ludgan van Moshoven, something like that. ask, how did you pull yourself out of dark places? Which Bible text have you read the most and why? I forgot to mention this in the course of my taking notes about it, but the answer to the Bible text would be Psalm 49. I'll try to remember that later as to why. Wallach 11 asks, as a devout Christian, how did you feel about the attitudes and behaviors of the New York underground music and art scene that you were close to? Very good question. Kennedy Greenford asks, where were you on the 9th of November, 1989? That other 9/11. What did you think about those events at the time? And a possible follow-up, how did you feel about life in general back then? Okay, so question about how I felt about the end of communism and the late 80s, early 90s, which I somewhat give, obviously, in my How We Got Here series, but I'll give you more of my personal thoughts. Richard Lund asks, what were your motivations for your moves to New York City, to Alaska, to Georgia? Secondly, what is your church life like in Georgia? Zentroshia asks, what is it specifically about the Baroque period that interests you? Your Cabinet of Curiosities video is thoroughly infused with Baroque sentiments, and I wonder why it is that you are taking a liking to the art and such of that period, as opposed to, say, the Middle Ages. I think I've listened to enough Hans Ruckmacher by now to guess that you're not an Enlightenment or Romantic type. Yeah, the Baroque era. I'll mention a little of that, although that can go way too far in the wrong direction. 2BR02B, am I missing a pronunciation here? To Brodsby, anyway, asks, not the most imaginative question, but it's what came to mind. Do you have any strong memories regarding where you were and what you were doing when you heard that President Kennedy had been killed, and when you heard about the 9/11 attacks? Okay, standard. And good. Knight Arnold again. I noticed that I don't know much about your family. Would love to know more. What's the story of your parents? Do you have any siblings? I would like to know more about my family. But we'll cover some of that, you'll see. Laura Giles asks, tell us a little bit about your father. You've mentioned your mom. Also, do you have any siblings? Also, she asks, has living in an Orthodox country interested you not only about their specific religious practices, but theological differences? Yes. What have you observed that intrigues you? Do the youth of Georgia seek a religious life? Do they want to be Christians? We'll mention that later. And finally, Kai Martella asks, what's Georgia like? And I will give you a very short answer to that as we end on this subject, but briefly, more than briefly, go to my Georgian Crossroads channel, and I explain a lot of what Georgia is like there. But I will mention more of it before we get out of here. If you want to learn something about me, and I think more importantly, the times that I live in, then I have lived in, and the people I've met, this might be helpful. So, I was born in Seattle, Washington in 1955, which for some of you is like, not too far distant from the Roman era. It's just way back there. Doesn't seem way back to me. That's one thing a lot of people don't understand who are younger about people who are older. They may look older, but they tend to remember their past like it was just yesterday. And although, fragmentary, but still. So my mother was Ukrainian Polish stock. The odd thing about that is she always told me she was just Polish. And later I started digging into it a little, and I said, well, Mom, your mother was born here, which is like a Polish town. I think it's Czernivtsi. And I said, and her last name, Taschuk, was, well, that's not really a Polish last name. And I said, And she moved to America to, she ended up marrying a Ukrainian man. That's more suspicious. When she first got here, he ended up dying, and then she married my Polish grandfather. And then there was my father, my biological father was Scottish Norwegian. And I say biological father because I have no memories of the man. I mean, I must somewhere in the deep recesses of my brain. But he was out of my life before the age of 3. And it's a sad story. I mean, now, in a sense, I think our lives are basically one series of tragic or difficult events on top of someone else's series of tragic or difficult events. I mean, I suppose there are a few people who get by with great family, not many problems, the things they want to do they're able to achieve, this sort of thing. But I don't think that's the majority of people. I think, in fact, those people cause me to question things much more than people who have difficulties in life. Because I say, like, well, how did they get that? When the rest of us seem to, like, blunder along into one thing after another. But anyway, interestingly enough, my grandmother, my mother's mother, was originally coming here. She came, I think she was around 19 years old. And she was fleeing, it wasn't Poland, and it wasn't Ukraine. It was the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and I don't know, right during World War I or something. And she had lost, about 4 of her brothers, and she was coming to find the remaining brother. So, who was in that most Ukrainian of all places, Manitoba. But I never met my mother because she died when my mother was 15, and my grandmother rather, because she died when my mother was 15, which was like a huge dagger blow strike to my mother. And I don't think she ever recovered from that because she never had the ability to do so. Her mother why not? Her mother spoke very broken English, and so she never really had a chance to communicate. She didn't speak Polish, really, and so she never really had a chance to communicate with her about her life, which is very strange. And my mother's father, who was Polish, but more from the German side of Poland, and I think it was even further west than Danzig or Gdansk, which was, in fact, they used to argue with each other, and my grandfather, my Polish grandfather, used to accuse her of talking Polish like a Russian, and my grandmother used to accuse him of speaking Polish like a German. So that tells you something. But anyway, my mother's relationship with her father was not very good. He was a World War I veteran. He was gassed in the trenches. He was actually born in Chicago, that most Polish of cities, from Polish immigrant parents. And so he never he never got over that. And in fact, to prove the point every now and then, he used to spit on the walls, and there would be blood in his spit, and make my mother clean it up. So that tells you an awful lot right there about their relationship. And so what she was doing was trying to get out away from the families, particularly after her mother died. It was just time to escape. Unfortunately, she escaped. When she was 17, she got married to my father, and unfortunately, he was, well, shall we say, immature. He was not a good husband, and he cheated on her while she was pregnant. So that, it's almost like her life was pretty good up until the age of 15, and then suddenly, bam. It never quite recovered after that. Although she did end up becoming a Christian later in life, but she was also always held on to her fears. She was a very, very fearful person, which is probably part of the reason why I'm not, is because as a child I had to react against that. And also I had to mature quickly to make sense of the world because, in a sense, well, skipping ahead slightly, my mother did get remarried, and then those marriages fell apart. My mother was a very weak figure, and I basically had no father figure. So it was kind of up to me to make sense of why the world was so crazy. No, I was not born in a Christian family by any means. Although I was not born in an anti-Christian family either. No one ever said, don't believe in God or anything, although, they might have said, don't be a fanatic about whatever. But there was I was not prejudiced one way or the other. I was just simply, I was not trained much one way or the other either. So, interestingly enough, my mother was so distraught over my father that she ended up ripping up all of her photos. And alas, I have no images of my father. I later saw one briefly that an aunt had, but unfortunately she's died, and that family turned into be quite a mess, to say the least. So I wouldn't want to go back that way and try to look for it. It's just life. Sometimes there are things that are left mysterious. I do know that my father eventually died sometime in maybe around 2008 or 9 or 10 or 11, sometime in that period. I do know that, but that's all I know about him, except for one other detail. Now, as far as his side of the family, I do not know. I met my grandmother, his mother, once. She had a disease which caused her to act like a child, and for the life of me, I can't remember exactly what that disease was. And then I never met my mother's father. He died in about 1965, but my mother never introduced me to him. Thanks, Mom. I know nothing about my father's father, and I only had this one brief encounter, which my mother dreaded as it happened, with the grandmother. And that was it. And my mother's mother had died. So essentially, for me, all history cuts off at just knowing that there are these grandparents. That's it. I don't know much about them. That's it. I've talked with a couple of my cousins who are not that close to me, but close enough that able to compare notes. They agreed she was Ukrainian. I was the first probably to come up with that, my mother's mother. But essentially, it was like everything seems to stop at my grandparents. So I am a person without history, I feel like, which is probably why I'm so fascinated by history. So by the time I was 3, my mother divorced, and we had moved to Hawaii, Honolulu, during the only president that I have ever seen in the flesh was Dwight David Eisenhower. And he came through. I was there just as Hawaii became a state, and I remember looking down on his open motorcade as he passed through. But Hawaii, suddenly my memory goes pop. Now, I'm not going to go into a lot of what I remember from Hawaii, except to say it was so different from anything else that I remember. I only have 1 or 2 images from before the age of 3 years old or earlier, of Seattle. But once I arrive in Hawaii, it's like, bam, everything is like Technicolor. And so I remember an awful lot about Hawaii. And that's where my memory kicks in really strongly. I mean, really strongly. And I think it was that change in scenery. You don't remember a lot of things. For instance, most of you will probably never remember the first time you were in a car. Why? It's because you were in a car since before you could remember. And so it seems normal. It doesn't stand out in your mind. I remember the first time I was on a plane at the age of 3. I remember looking outside of the window and there were propellers. It was a big plane. It was not a jet. It was a plane going from Seattle to Hawaii. I also remember that when we took the plane, the jet from Hawaii back to California, where I would eventually move, there were no more propellers. So that tells you something. You remember. What starts to stand out is what strikes you. But I have a lot of thoughts about memory. You can go to my time and memory videos and learn more about me there than you probably need to know, but more about how the memory works, at least how I understand it. So I've never had any siblings, none that I remember. And what I mean by that is my father went on to get married again. In fact, my mother never got a dime of support money for me. So we always grew up very poor. But she tried to once, and then found out he had already had another family with a couple of children, and he had skipped out on them. So people have asked me, did you ever want to contact your father? And I was kind of like, the guy really never gave me much apart from genetics. And I didn't have much of an interest in it. I don't have anything against the guy. I don't walk around going, oh my God, what a terrible person he was. I don't know what was motivating him at all. Now, evidently, my mother hated him and hated all of her memories. And there was a problem with destroying one's memories, or trying to. You can't really. So when we were in Hawaii, however, my mother remarried twice. On the second time, she chose a man who happened to be an alcoholic. This was not a good choice. She chose this kind of person because she felt so bad about herself that she felt if she could help someone in worse shape than herself, she might feel better. There was actually a man she talks about who seemed like he was a good man, and she rejected him in favor of the severely troubled man. And I see this a lot, and it has to do with one's sense of self-worth, of which she had almost none. And that was a bad choice. And when we arrived, and he lived in the San Francisco Bay Area, and so he decided it was time to move us from, when I was 7 years old, from Hawaii to California, where I did most of my growing up, starting at the age of 7. And I won't go into too much of the bloody details about their relationship, except to say it really didn't work out. My mother actually tried to kill herself at one point. I was in deep trouble as a child. I remember they used to drag me into the school counselor at that time, and they would say, we don't understand why he's just drawing circles in class. This is when I first arrived. By the way, it's a very bad thing to show up in a new school with a child mid-year, particularly a child, below a certain age, because that's really hard to get over. And in fact, I was actually a fairly well-adjusted child, pretty sociable kid in Hawaii. There are photos of me playing with children, and those photos disappear. You don't see anything like that once I get to California, because the society was so different. And it's the kind of thing that, hey, I didn't have any choice in the matter, and nor did I have a choice in my mother's choice, which is something I had to forgive her for later, because she felt so bad about herself, she took me down with her, which also relates to the wanting to kill herself, or trying to, which I don't think she could ever forgive herself for, knowing what she did to me, which she really needed to forgive herself for. I forgave her. Yeah, my mother started to go into a shell at that point. Once she shook off the the man who kept chasing us. And it really was a man who kept chasing us, because we would move someplace, he would find us, move in again, then we would move again. This happened 4 times in about the course of a year. And it was just crazy stuff. My mother used to see me drawing monsters breaking through walls and stuff, and she would say things. I remember her saying something to me like, well, she would always talk about they. She always reading pop psychology. They say that if a child is drawing monsters and stuff, it's a sign of that something is wrong. To which I'm sitting there going like, well, do you think? Of course there is. But rather than do anything about it, which is where the tragedy comes in, she just started feeling worse about it. So she declined. Eventually, her social world contracted to 1 or 2 people. And it was like that for years and years, from, I would say, the age of when I was 8 until I was about 16. She hardly dealt with the outside world at all. Someone asked me, where was I when President Kennedy was shot? Well, interestingly enough, I arrived in California in March of 1963. So in November of 1963, I was fully there. And I remember that moment when the teacher walked into the room. We had a really, really primitive television system. I remember they were just starting to talk about showing videos to the kids, or at least watching them. There were things on television at certain hours on the public broadcasting system that you could show to your children. And I remember us watching, turning on the news on this really cruddy black and white set in the class. And I haven't thought about this for ages, but my memory is like, bam, snaps back in. And then I remember us being sent home, and I was 7 years old. Didn't really understand what was going on. And then girls were crying, and I walked probably about half a mile or a little more than a kilometer home, or about a kilometer or whatever, home. And and then we watched television all weekend. And I think that's the beginning of my interest in history, because I did similar things when Martin Luther King and Robert Kennedy were shot during the moon landings, of course. I became interested in what was going on in our times. And in fact, what was interesting was, I think one of the things that happened was after Kennedy's death, things started changing, which I go into great length at in my How We Got Here series. But I saw it. That is to say, I was a young kid, and when I grew up, everyone had short hair. Most of the kids had crew cuts. There were almost no, I'm trying to think if I remember seeing anyone with a beard. I don't remember seeing anyone with a beard prior to, say, 1966 or so. I'm trying to think if I had any. No, I don't remember seeing anyone like that. Maybe one middle school teacher, probably was kind of a beatnik or something. But then I started seeing things change. I mean, it was the squarest of all worlds. All the women wore dresses. I think it's really funny now when they go back and they do the past. They're always putting women into some kind of pantsuit in the 1950s or whatever. They're trying to do as much as they can to make it like now, whereas in fact it wasn't like now. Women wore dresses most of the time. Jeans were occasionally worn, but it wasn't nearly as common as it would later become. But, and women did their hair, hairspray was like a part of, it was always there. And it was like really flammable as well. And really it was like, putting floss on your Christmas tree. Another weird thing of the times, this lethal stuff that you would, put on your Christmas trees and bring it home. Just crazy stuff. Anyway, I remember, this was very important to me, watching the first hippies. You see, I lived in San Rafael, California, just north of San Francisco. And I remember when the first people, you start seeing people with longer hair and with beards, and women who were wearing these kind of like granny dresses, or, you know, the women with long flowing hair. You didn't see that much of women with long flowing hair. There were some girls who kind of did that, who had been part of the folk revival, and there, you know, we saw a little bit of that. But I'm trying to think. There were very few girls in my class that had long hair. There were some, and they stood out for being different. But I remember just watching this. I remember talking with my young, like 12-year-old friends about, you know, what was a hippie? Meanwhile, I had started listening to the music. When I was around 11, 12 years old, I discovered music. And what an age to discover music in. It was like 1966, 1967. Which is when the music was changing as well. So I remember a little bit before that hearing the Beatles going like, you know, she loves you, yeah. It didn't mean anything to me. By the time of Sgt. Pepper's, however, that meant a lot to me. The music, and so I was conscious by that time. Started buying records at that time. What it was I started getting really interested in music. Did I become a hippie kid? No. Did I grow my hair? Yes. Did I dress a little differently? Yes. Did I ever take drugs? Was I ever interested in drugs? No. And the reason I was never interested in drugs was because that stepfather that my mother who brought me to California, was a total alcoholic. He also did pills and stuff. And I just took a look at that and said, this is too close. This is, I couldn't articulate it myself, but one form of altered state was pretty much, to me, like another form of altered state. And so I maintained from that point on, I was just never going to be like that. Which left me increasingly isolated among the few friends I had, because they all started being seduced by the siren song, because the music went along with this stuff. But I really liked the changes in the music. I collected rock records. I had about 500, singles before I was 15. Maybe 100 albums, which is quite a nice little record collection. I got very curious as to where it came from. So I started getting interested in the blues, and I started getting interested in classical music. I would go to the public library, San Rafael Public Library, and I remember, where I was when I put on this Beethoven Ninth Symphony record. It was the one, green cover, Leopold Stokowski conducting. How do I remember that? It's because I went back and bought it later. I remember everything about music. I don't see myself as a particularly intelligent person, which some people find funny, but it's because everyone in school was doing better than I was. When I was in middle school, I was put in the dumbbell math class. I remember, I was humiliated over and over in middle school, which you didn't ask about, so I'm not going to tell you too much about, but I will tell you this. I was put in the dumbbell math class and was given a second copy of the teacher's manual. Later, I got a few people to sign my little yearbook, and they say, "Burn to a math genius." I said, you know what? I was just smart enough not to copy every answer, but to miss some so I would have to get corrected. And I got out of the dumbbell math class, went into another math class in high school, eventually just completely stopped doing math altogether because my brain didn't work that way. But sometimes I was just, this far removed from the criminals and the guys who are kind of like doing this. So I always have had a kind of a empathy for the people who are on the bottom, because pretty much I was classified there myself, particularly during junior high, as we called it then. But I remember, was I weird? Was I a weird kid? Was I a geek? No, I was not. I was not weird. I was not the kind of kid, you often see these depictions of, or even the kind of person we consider to be a geek now. Was I making jokes about music? Absolutely not. To me, music was serious. That's, to me, the main dividing line between geekdom and actually becoming something of a scholar about something. If you're making all these math jokes and all these chess jokes and all these anime jokes and video game jokes, if everything you're doing you're totally absorbed in it, but it's also the source of all your humor in life, you're a geek. Welcome to the club, but it's not my club. I was totally serious about music. And I had one other friend who collected music with me for a while, but then he started doing drugs, and it was kind of like, well, farewell. I mean, it was farewell on his part because I ceased being so interesting. But anyway, how long is this going to take? Was I weird? Not in that sense, no. No one would have said, oh, there's that weird guy. And people have asked me, what about girls and stuff? Did you get attracted to girls? Yeah, but I also had a very low opinion of myself, and I think that came from my mother and all of that. I remember in junior high school, this one girl sent another girl up to me to tell me that she really liked me. My state of mind at the time was that they were trying to torture me. Because I didn't know how girls communicated at all. I had no girls as part of my social world. One sister of a friend who just kind of hated us, but as far as the guys I knew, there absolutely no contact with girls, no sister, no nothing. So to me, that kind of thing was just like, you're just making fun of me. And so it didn't occur to me until much later, like 10 years later, that, oh, that was how this girl was telling me she liked me. She was getting her friend to do it for her as kind of like almost like a bit of gossip. So, but that tells you something about my attitude towards girls. At the same time, I really did like that girl. I just, shut down. But as my friends did more and more drugs, I did get isolated. As they became more like what they were supposed to become by the lights of the new changing times, and this was by high school, I was becoming something else. It was in 1970, early 1970, that I first noticed these strange people who had wandered on to the high school campus. Such a thing would never happen today because they would be arrested for trespassing and what are you trying to do to our children and such. But this was a group of people who were passing out these kind of psychedelic looking pamphlets about Jesus. And they were singing songs and stuff. But they weren't necessarily singing them to us. Anyway, I noticed them, but I didn't do anything about them. It's just kind of like, whatever. And then one of my friends who'd been doing drugs, Greg Pearson, came up to me and told me that, hey, I had become a Christian through this group. And I knew this guy, and I said, well, no, you didn't. You're doing drugs. And he goes like, no, I did. And I was like, yeah. I just didn't believe him at all. And then he would try to tell me about God, and, I had heard one or two words about God or the Bible growing up, and so I thought I knew something, which of course I didn't. And, and I said, well, what about this? What about that? And he said, well, I'm having a Bible study with some friends, and there were other people like him who had become Christians, kind of Christian hippies, and there were people who had been like stoners, on the school campus, and they'd become Christians and stopped doing drugs and were meeting like on the school, like in the football field, just meeting and such. And there's a huge story here which I'm not going to go into. But anyway, one thing led to another, and he ended up inviting me to a Bible study at night that was part of this new thing called the Jesus movement. Now, actually, it had been going on, been growing since about 1967. And there was a Southern Baptist minister, Kent Philpott, who had been going to the Haight-Ashbury, and they eventually created communes. I mean, what had happened in this hippie world was by 1967, so many people had come in because of the Summer of Love, that now you were starting to already get the wreckage from that. You were starting to get the wreckage of people, too many abortions, too many drug overdoses, too many weird sexual diseases, too much of everything, too much, Eastern philosophy, too much everything. Iskander asked, well, did you ever think about any other religions? Or why did you become a Christian? Well, for one thing, I could see what was happening on the Eastern religion front with the people who were going that way. And it wasn't something that appealed to me whatsoever. It also, of course, we didn't know any Islamic folk at the time. But no, what happened was, as I was talking, when I became a Christian, I didn't become a Christian because of wanting to feel good. I became a Christian because I was convinced of the truth of it. I had already very clearly seen how bad life could be. There's lots, hey, my mother tries to commit suicide. That's good enough without going into all the rest of it. That tells you something about the darkness of life. So for me, the fact that life was dark was absolutely clear. Secondly, interestingly enough, even in the music I was listening to, it was changing and becoming more commercial. And I was wondering what was happening there. I think, in a sense, I'd lost my faith in rock and roll because I saw that something else was going on. In other words, I was seeing the corruption of life. But I also always knew, for instance, I could hang out with this one friend, but he didn't like this other guy. And I could hang out with this one guy, and he didn't like that guy. So I had like 4 or 5 young friends who all couldn't stand each other because they were all too different. And I thought, well, that's not right, because they're all interesting people. And it would be a shame if they just couldn't realize. So I could see there was something good, too. So I could see real darkness and real good. Even I could see that in my mother as well. And I could see that life was interesting. And I could also see that it was filled with tortures and strange betrayals and things. So, hearing the story of the gospel, I realized, oh yeah, this is all about that. That is to say, this is all about the fact that the world is both completely beautiful and completely hideous, all at once. To me, and this is the one thing that's never, for 5 seconds, ever changed in my view, and that is that the world is like that. And the Bible, people say, yeah, the Bible was written thousands of years ago and doesn't relate to our times today. You know what? The world the Bible describes is exactly the same world we live in. All the heroes in the Bible, fallen characters, David, Moses, all of the darkness in the Bible is really dark, and the world is really dark. And people who say, yeah, but you got to look at it positively, I was just like, sorry, you're not living in the actual world, because the actual world is difficult. I think that's why this year many people are starting to say, what is going on? Because the world isn't such a pretty place as we imagined it to be in our delusion. But that was one of the main things. And also, I could see that there has to be an answer. That is to say, that life posed a question. I could already see that by the age of 15, especially listening to all this music I was listening to, like Eric Burdon and the Animals saying, there is a man somewhere who is closer to the truth. Or, it's like even the Beatles singing their dopey, all you need is love. Yeah, but look around you. People aren't doing that. Love is obviously an answer, but we're not doing it. And seeing the story of Christ without going, this is not a theology lesson, but without going into it, to me, the story of the crucifixion and resurrection and the story of Jesus was obviously something that had to be real. It couldn't be a lie. It was just like way too close to the reality that we lived in. And of course, as time went on, I started to see that more clearly. But that is why I became a Christian. And when I became a Christian, everything changed. Which, I mean, for me, it was everything. My life, just, if I sometimes stop and think, what would have happened if I had kept on the path I was going on and not become a Christian when I did? It was just like, I can't even imagine, because I can only see it getting darker. I cannot see light breaking through, because light wasn't breaking through. I can see myself slipping into some really dark habits and ways of thinking as I would go on. And, not that I wouldn't have become intelligent and interested in things, maybe become some sort of artist, who knows? It's impossible for me to know. But all I know is this, is I was going this way and then bam, I was going that way. And everything changed. I was able to, I started singing and making music because I was around other people who were singing and making music. I started being able to relate to girls much easier than, it was really strange. Suddenly it was like my whole social world had changed. I'd gone from being an introvert to being kind of an extrovert. It was just very weird, which is why I'm totally against anyone who is a determinist of any stripe. When people come up to me and tell me that, it's your biology, your evolution, your chemistry, your genetics, your social situation, your class structure, whatever, I'm always kind of like, you have no idea what you're talking about. People can change radically. Maybe certain fundamental character traits don't change, but all I know is that I was not the same person at the age of 14 that I was by the age of 16. I was radically, radically different. But within a year, I had met such a cast of characters, had so many experiences. It was October of 1970 when I became a Christian. Had so many radically different experiences that, literally the next couple of years, just the next year, I could probably write 200 or 300 pages on, because it was so, again, it was one of these moments of where suddenly everything came into focus. Part of it was because there were these communes we lived on. I was still in high school, but eventually at the age of 17, I graduated early from high school and went on to live on a commune. Big story there I'm not going into, because you didn't ask. But essentially it was like Dickensian as far as like the amount of characters and what was happening. Just all of the things that occurred. If I just start with just the summer of 1971 all by itself, and it's very rare that I tell these stories because it's so far out of other people's experience that they don't know how to relate to it. It's hard to talk to someone who is like 50 years old or 40 years old or 20 years old or 30 years old and have them even relate to this, because it's like, my God, it's like you're in a Russian novel. It's like, it's just so different. Let me give you one example of the kind of thing I'm talking about. And I'm not even going to explain the whole story. I'm just going to give you a little bit of the outline of a story. And it was the time we had, in our group, we had about 3 or 4 at this time, different little house communes in Marin County and Sonoma County. And this was the summer of 1971. I was staying for a few weeks at Baraka House, it was called, and it was on Magnolia Avenue in Petaluma, which was out in the country. And I remember we had this problem where one of the people we knew had been kidnapped by the Children of God. The Children of God were this cult coming through and basically scooping up anybody they would to take on these school buses to go live on their communes. And I remember us going, they had taken over a Christian school. I think it was it in Healdsburg, or it was somewhere further out in Sonoma County. And so, no, it wasn't quite Healdsburg. I think it was more like maybe closer to Cotati or Santa Rosa. But I remember we had to go and try to get them out of the school system. We had a guy come to us the night before who had walked all night to get away from them. And so they had just kind of wormed their way into this, saying, this is the voice of the Lord. And these poor dumb Christians were like, oh, okay. And they gave them this whole thing. And so we went there, and I remember there was a guy just sitting playing the guitar, singing in tongues. I remember these people chanting all this stuff. I remember, then the guy said, I just learned the guitar this morning. And it sounded like it. But it was a very, very strange thing, going to this place to try to get these people out. Now, I, being the young mascot, was just along for the ride. It was the guys like Cliff or Kenny who had come along. They were a bit older than I was, and they were trying to, get these guys out of there. They weren't all that successful that day. But the point is, it's these weird stories that the next few years is filled with. From the summer of 1971, that's just one of about 20 stories like that are just like, how do you put this into a contemporary box where anyone understands it? You don't. If I was to, just the irrationality, the cult, the whole thing is just like, this wasn't like meeting these people, through a television special, it's just like, and tonight, the Children of God cult. No, this was the real thing. This was going in. And I have lots of those experiences. Tons, actually. One of the things that happened was, I should mention, someone asked about my intellectual history, which kind of starts it starts actually with the all that listening to music and wanting to understand. At that time, there was very little you could read about music, as far as rock music and where it came from. So I was doing all my own research and trying to follow and track things down, which is how I eventually became good at it. Because I got to the point where I just sniff it out, where the history was located. And always go to the prime source before anything else. But in school, amongst my other strange friends who had become Christians, we were doing some very weird things. We were reading church history. If you asked me who Polycarp was, or Irenaeus, or Athanasius, I knew all the answers to those questions. It's just like, I love the martyrdom of Polycarp as a story, the early church fathers, if you were to ask me, I'd be reading John Wesley's journals. Of course, I read C.S. Lewis. I started reading G.K. Chesterton at this point. But of course, the Lewis stuff I was reading was like Mere Christianity, Miracles, Chronicles of Narnia, the obvious stuff. But that was kind of weird for high school students to be reading those kinds of things. After high school, things began to change within the commune, and we slowly started morphing into a cult. One of the things, when I moved into Baraka House at the age of 17, graduating in January of 1973 from high school, graduating early, we were kind of under attack from some renegade people who had been who had been there. This guy named Red had been in prison, and he'd kind of gotten at least half of the people to rebel with him. When I arrived there was chicken wire on the windows because we were afraid of getting firebombed. We had about 10 cars on the property, all of which had slashed tires from this guy. And then he had unplugged, without us knowing it, the large freezer we had outside with all the pork from all the animals we had, and ruined it all. So this is what I was moving into, and it was because of this sort of sense of, okay, we've run into the limits of that kind of feel-good, anarchistic Christianity that I'd been a part of before. And now what was starting to happen is we needed rules and discipline. And not being a regular church, we tended to look for the rules and discipline in places I think you shouldn't look into. I mentioned a bit of this in my last interview with Paul Vanderklay. But we slowly were morphing into a cult. So after a while, it was like, we were getting too much into exorcism. We were, who you married and what you did with your money, where you lived. All these things were starting to be part of your life, and that was too much. I don't think we ever became heretical as far as the basic doctrines of the faith. But as far as our practice, yes, I think we went way over the line. Can you imagine me at the age of 20 running a commune? Well, that happened for a little while, and then what happened was that it was clear that, hey, what's a 20-year-old know about this sort of thing? And so I failed at that. I also, at this point in my life, got engaged to this girl that I was going to marry, and then one of the elders basically told me it's not God's will, and that was the end of it. Did it leave me bitter? It left me confused is what happened. And I went through a period where my running the commune failed, where it was kind of like this engagement, and the girl never talked to me after that, which I really think was wrong. I mean, looking back, I'm kind of glad I didn't marry her, because if she was like that, it wouldn't have lasted anyway. You have to have openness in order to be married. You have to be willing to talk all night about stuff. But that really did affect myself. Like I said, I had gotten to the point where I was having no problems relating to girls within this Christian world or without. And that kind of knocked me back down and allowed some of my failings to bubble within my brain more. So I was engaged and disengaged. But I did not give up. I didn't give up on the church, which by that time we'd become a church called the Church of the Open Door, which had, by this point, we'd gone from being maybe about 35 people loosely associated with different Christian communes to, I'd say we were heading between 1,200 and 1,500 people in all the different branches of the church by this point. And this was about 3, 4, or 5 years later. So I eventually, during this period, I was kind of sent to live as a younger brother over someone who was younger than me. It was just, don't even begin to ask. But it was during this period that I think I did not rebel against the leadership, because we had this whole thing about discipline and rebellion and stuff. Instead, what I did was I found a way through it. And one of the things that happened was, this is the point at which I really began to learn. I actually started going to university at this point, at least junior college. And without going into that, it was just like clearly not for me. So I said, okay, I'm going to teach myself. And so at this point, I'm reading the more academic and literary works of C.S. Lewis, which no one else had read. I was reading the works of George MacDonald, particularly his kind of cosmic adult fairy tales like Lilith this is late 19th century Victorian Scottish Christian writer, but highly unusual work, and to me so potent in imagination, but that when I finally did see Star Wars, I was like completely like, oh, that's not very imaginative at all. It never captured me as a work of imagination. I always thought like, God, what stupid names, It's just like, it's like, yeah, light and dark, who cares? I mean, read George MacDonald if you want some really good imaginative stuff. I was reading classic literature too. Like I read several of the works of Victor Hugo, including The Hunchback of Notre Dame and Toilers of the Sea and The Man Who Laughed. I really loved that. Moby Dick, 1984, Brave New World. I would read books on American history. I read Uncle Tom's Cabin, which I thought, and still think, great book. Brought me to tears. It was so intense. The works of Edgar Allan Poe. I even read Michel Foucault's book on insanity at this period. And most importantly, I discovered the work of Solzhenitsyn at this point. This period of time up until I would eventually leave the group and go to L'Abri in Switzerland. Also at this point, I had actually gotten rid of all my records, then started another collection of this Jesus rock music, then kind of got rid of that at a certain point, or left it in the house I was living in because it was all the records were getting scratched up. And I'm jumping over tons of material here. But I remember one thing that happened was I was working in a bookstore, and there was a guy who was talking to me who said something like, yeah, Taxi Driver is a great movie. And I remember going to see the movie Taxi Driver probably about, 6 months after it was released. And I remember I'd come there halfway through the last showing of the film. And I remember there were 2 other people in the theater and myself. And if you've ever seen Taxi Driver, you know how bloody it gets. And I had never seen a film like that. I had hardly seen any films between the years 1970 and 1976, 77. I'd say 77. Hardly seen any movies in that period. Maybe 2 or 3 in the movie theater. And nothing on television. Because we didn't have television. So, when I saw this film, I was horrified by the bloodshed in it. More importantly, there were these people sitting over there, these other 2 people, maybe they were stoned, I don't know. They were laughing at it. Now, Taxi Driver, if you've ever seen it, you know it's about this guy who's kind of Vietnam vet, comes from some sort of Dutch Calvinist background, because Paul Schrader wrote the film, and he put that in there. That is his background. And as these people were laughing at the mayhem occurring on the screen, particularly at the end, I started to stand up. And I was going to yell at them, and I was going to say, how can you laugh at this? And just before I did, I suddenly realized they're going to think I'm like him. Because anyone who points things out that are wrong is going crazy like the taxi driver. They're going to think I'm like this guy. And who knows, maybe on some level I would be like this guy. And I sat down and I said, as far as the game on the board goes, I've just been put in serious check. And that's when I decided we used to understand the hippie culture, but the world has moved on. And we don't understand what's going on anymore. And I said to myself, I need to understand what's going on so that I can just simply communicate with people. And so from that point, I started 2 things. I started going to movies and taking notes. I no longer take notes because I don't really have to. And secondly, I started listening to punk rock around the same time because I heard this. I remember there was a television broadcast where someone said something like, yeah, there's this angry new music coming out of England. And they showed the Sex Pistols. And I thought to myself, that's really strange. These people are really angry and stuff. And I don't know anything about this. I don't know why. I don't know what's going on. But I felt something in my heart that said, I should find out why. And again, it was just basically out of compassion. What's going on here? Around this time, I was also invited to a seminar of the film series, How Should We Then Live, which had been made based on the work of Francis Schaeffer at L'Abri in Switzerland. I knew a little bit about Schaeffer, and in fact, they had come through, and the reason we got the tickets was because they had come through and shot one of the scenes near where we lived. And so they gave us a few free tickets, and I said, okay, thanks. And someone said, Bern, you'd probably like this. Believe me, I did. I went there, and I heard them talking about things in a way we never did. That the intellectual and creative forces and movements of the times actually meant something, which connected with how I looked at things ever since I had discovered music as a kid. And I was becoming increasingly, for instance, I would read something like C.S. Lewis's Discarded Image and have no one to talk to about it. I mean, I understood it and no one else could even get in the ballpark, because they were all still reading whatever the evangelical book of the month was. They were all just following these normally laid out tracks. And evidently I'd already gotten on some other track somewhere that was taking me somewhere else. So, without going into the whole story, one thing led to another, and I arrived at a very strange point in my life. And I didn't know what to do. Truthfully, I was being asked to be a missionary in Mexico and training for that. But like I say, you didn't ask, you're not going to get this story. And then I decided, I was spending far more time reading all 3 volumes of Solzhenitsyn's Gulag Archipelago, which were just coming out as I was during that period. And I said to myself, I am far more interested in this than I am in going to Mexico. Why am I going to Mexico? And so I said, okay, I'm going to not go. And I actually got permission not to go. Notice how I phrased that. And then my mom said, well, you like that Labrie place. Why don't you go there? And I went, ding. I should do that. I should go to Switzerland. I had no idea what I was thinking. But I knew one person who had been, and I asked him a bit of information about it. And then I went and worked in Glacier National Park in Montana. Tried to make a bit of money to save up to go. Ended up going. And this would be the next moment in my life when everything completely changed. Because this was huge. This was like, to put it in terms you'll all understand, this was like getting the next operating system, the upgrade from being just a Christian. I mean, the Jesus People was pretty fantastic in the beginning, but then, like I said, then we were just mutating either into just another normal, stupid, independent church, or we were mutating into a cult, depending on which part of the church you were part of. And I said to myself, I'm going nowhere here. I'm working sorting industrial laundry. It's just crazy. What am I doing with myself? And so in Switzerland, it was suddenly I was given permission, not only that all that reading I had been doing and thinking about, like punk rock and movies and stuff, that really mattered, but that I was given permission to question the people who were talking to me in a serious way in which I wasn't given permission before. And that was really important to me because I had to be able to say, what are we doing? And that's where I started to... Labrie basically would always say, yeah, but everything we're telling you, you got to ask questions about, which was wonderful. That just freed me up completely. I spent a year there. It's a very important period of my time. One of the most important periods is, so I started really seriously thinking about the arts, the scientific and intellectual life, the creative world, things happening in the larger society. Suddenly I started going like, ooh, and it was just like my brain, it was like, I went from, I often think in terms of computers, like, I used to have a Mac, an iMac computer that has less memory in it. In fact, the first 4 Mac computers had less memory in it than this does. This is just 250 gigs in this little thing, which was far more than all that. What I was being given was something massive that I put into myself and just said, bam. And suddenly everything, it was like, okay, I'm awake. And the burn from 1979, we'll say, is the same burn you're looking at now. I mean, there were other moments when things changed, but that's the main thing that really kicked it off. Rookmacher Hans Ruckmacher, I came across, unfortunately he had died the year before I got there, and I was so like, wanted to talk to him after listening to his lectures. But listening to his lectures, I mean, I read his book, Modern Art and Death of a Culture, and some other books he'd written, but it was listening to his lectures that did it for me. And you can find them online at the Libri Ideas Library. And they may be old, but they're not dated, because he always talked about, history. And if you understand talking about history, you understand when you're dealing with history, things don't get dated; they just get historical. And but that was the thing that first gave me the interest in the Baroque period, and in Dutch Calvinism in specific, because I saw he would keep pointing back, and there were other people at Libri who would as well, pointing back to the 17th century in the Netherlands as a very interesting period of time. Over the years, I would discover that ballet started during that period. That this was a period of like real, as a Christian goes, real intellectual achievement. In a sense, the people of that era lost the ground by the Enlightenment coming up from under them. Which is a real shame, because they were standing on a lot of really interesting ideas. But even someone like Pascal is from that period. I find lots of interesting stuff there. There are huge problems with that era as well. If I lived there, which I wouldn't mind, but it would be like, I probably wouldn't live to be as old as I am right now. And also there were certainly religious wars going on at the time, which was highly unfortunate between the Protestants and Catholics, but more it was between governments. It was just, again, when Christianity gets too involved with power, you start getting into some real problems. But did I meet Larry Norman or Mark Hurd there, I was asked? No, but I did have a very good friend of mine there named Dave de Koopkrank, who unfortunately died about 20 years ago, who was who worked with those guys and recorded with them, and he was a very good friend at the time, and we used to have all these very interesting conversations, and he was really fascinated by my ideas even at that time about rock music and the culture and such. I'd already put in enough work at that time to make some sort of sense of something. But eventually it was time to go back to California, and again, I'm skipping all of this stuff. You're just getting the stone across the top of the pond here. And California didn't work out for a variety of reasons. It just wasn't good to go back. And so I ended up, but I knew where I was trying to get to, and that was New York City. So I went to Glacier National Park, worked another summer there in Montana, and then from there, I didn't even know what I was going to do when I went to work there the second time. But by the end of it, I knew I should be in New York City. So rather than go back to California, I just went straight to New York City. And oh my goodness, that's a whole different kettle of fish. Why did I go to New York? It was because I was already choosing to study the history of the counterculture, the history of popular culture, and asking the questions of why did these things come? And I knew New York was the center of it, and I needed to get there, which proved to be an excellent move on the board, which also answers the question why I never got married, because so many of the women I met in New York City, and unfortunately just the circles I was in, were unbalanced, and frankly, given my background, I didn't have the wherewithal intellectually, or well, that's the wrong word, emotionally, to know how to deal with them. And so there were a couple of, shall we say, close calls, but and I was certainly interested in women, but every time I'd meet one, after a while you'd find out, oh, this one's a heroin addict, or, oh, this one does this weird thing. It's just like, I forbear to list the problems I'd run into, but they were on that sort of magnitude. It was just not a good place to meet a sane woman. Had I been thinking, I was going to an Episcopalian church for a while there, but had I been thinking, I probably should have gone to a different kind of a church, maybe the Ukrainian Orthodox Church or something, and I would have met probably the right kind of person there. But alas, I felt called to be in this strata of which there were no other Christians. And it wasn't like I was just going to convert somebody or anything like that. So ultimately, I looked at it as a sacrifice. Around the age of 33, I went through a lot of soul searching about myself, asking myself, what is going on with me? And around a little bit before that, I could feel New York sucking me in. I mean, did it affect me? Absolutely. Fortunately, my faith was strong enough that I could get out of there alive. But no, absolutely. I mean, one of the problems also there was that people tend to leave quite regularly. So people would be there for about 5-6 years and then be gone. So I was there 16 years. I did not in any way have the same set of friends when I left as when I started, although I was by the time I left, I did have quite an interesting collection and assortment of people that I had interacted with, and I felt very good about that. This was a period for me of intellectual discoveries. Whether it was discovering the works of Jacques Ellul or Owen Barfield. Who wants me? Oh, it's an advertisement. Or whether it was discovering the horror fiction of H.P. Lovecraft, really discovering the art of cinema. I didn't have a television. I would go to the theaters, and I went to movies regularly enough and there were enough revivals of old films that I got a chance to see things on the big screen. That's a big story about my relationship to film, but it is important. I got more interested and involved in classical music. I worked in the music industry as a buyer and was exposed to so much music, not only exposed to so much music, but exposed to so many musicians. I can't even begin to discuss that here. It's where I first discovered the films of Tarkovsky, where I first read the books of Dostoevsky, where I first read Jung, whom I would later reject in large part. Not large part, about 50% of Jung I put in the category of, no, sorry, that's too occult for me. But then there's a bunch of stuff that he talks about, archetypes and anima and animus. I go like, yeah, that's on the good side. So let's see. I developed a deep interest in symbolism, collecting symbolism dictionaries, being very attentive to the symbolic. I also got interested in the changing nature of comic books at that time as they were maturing on some level. Manga and anime, the Japanese forms of comics and film. That's where I really took off in my understanding of horror films, was in New York City. Reading people like Stephen King. But I also read great mystery writers like Dashiell Hammett. I would see foreign films quite a bit. I learned a lot more about strictly anarchism. That is to say that in the last few years I was in New York, I learned a lot about serious anarchy. And I don't mean the left-wing stuff, which to me is like the children's version. I mean the people like Bob Black who would write The Abolition of Work and stuff like this. And probably most importantly was all that exposure to music history in so many ways. Not only, expanding my record collection, of which so much of it I got for free or for practically nothing. I mean, I built my library up from being very, very, very judicious, and also having access that most people don't have. And later, in the second half of my time in New York City, I actually bought and sold record collections, and I just got so much stuff there that didn't cost me hardly anything at all. Then I would turn around and sell it, so it paid for itself over and over. One of the questions, where were you in, November 11th, which was 9/11 in Europe, the way they write it there, of 1989. And the answer is, I was with friends in New York City, and interestingly enough, I thought it was pretty important, but most of the people I knew at the time did not. That is to say, they were kind of like, oh, that's kind of nice. Because most of the artists and such, and I mentioned this in the Origins of the Culture War video, most of the people I knew, they were already on to the culture war. The culture war had already started. That Cold War, who cared about that anymore? For the end of the Soviet Union, however, I had a Russian friend, and I remember spending that weekend with him. And that became very important because we were really monitoring that situation. It was good to have a Russian to help me monitor, Sergei Paradisov. So, yeah. But, let's see. Was I there for September 11th? No. I was gone by then. I'd gone to Alaska. Why had I gone to Alaska? Because in 1993, a time when I realized it was very interesting in New York, I could already see the end. I could already see that this world was going to end. I wasn't even thinking about the internet yet. And that would certainly be a thing which ended a certain kind of culture in New York City. But I just could feel something coming. In fact, I have an entry in my journal where I wrote, I am leaving New York City because I feel that it is ground zero for whatever is coming. And I was thinking terrorism. So, but I knew, when I thought about leaving New York, I thought, where do I go? Part of me wanted to go back to Switzerland. Part of me always wants to go back to Switzerland. It's probably the most important place, L'Abri. And which is why I have visited there many times over the years and had a chance to teach there, which is why occasionally I put those lectures up. But no, there's the question of what do you do with your library? Then I thought about, another city in America. No, I didn't want to go to someplace too hot, which is ironic because now I'm in Tbilisi, Georgia, which gets pretty darn hot in the summer, but I don't mind it so much. So I said to myself, let's not go to another big city. What would be the point of moving to Boston or San Francisco or wherever from New York City? I'm in New York. I have a good life here. I've got the proof that I have a good life because someone filmed my farewell party in New York City, and it looks pretty good. I mean, you just go like, wow, Bern, why did you leave all that? Because it was time to go. That's all I can tell you. It was time to get out. Part of it is, by about 93, 94, I had come to my main breakthroughs on why the culture had changed so much. And I said, now it's time to go away and start to put things together. I thought to myself, now I need to go somewhere where my library is more of a resource for the community. I thought, let's go to a small place. Let's go to some place that has I like snow, I like mountains, I like water. Let's go to some place like that. And eventually, as I was thinking about Canada, I was thinking about, I thought about Vermont for about 5 minutes. As soon as I would ask people, what do you think of Vermont? They go like, oh man, I've got friends up there. I go, okay, no, it's going to be filled with New Yorkers. Which is not that I dislike New Yorkers, but I was wanting something different now, to learn something different. Eventually I was reading about British Columbia, and I remember thinking to myself, what's that thing right over it? I go like, that's Alaska. I go like, how come I don't think about Alaska? I said, polar bears, igloos, Eskimos. Great. It can't possibly be like that. It has to actually be like British Columbia, especially the part right along the coast. And indeed it was. And without going into the whole story of how I discovered it and how I decided to go there, I ended up discovering Haines, Alaska, and decided this was the place. And it was a great decision. Haines, Alaska was a wonderful place to end up. I ended up working at the local radio station, KHNS. For 10 years, I was the program director, producer, music supervisor, music director. I also, it was in Alaska where I first started getting interested in puppetry, because I started going on European trips, particularly starting in 2005. It wasn't my first time back to Europe, but I went on a trip then where I spent a couple of months investigating puppet theaters, and that said, okay, we got to go back to Alaska and start doing this. Big story here. Also, I would invite musicians up to Alaska, so my good friends Deke Dickerson, Barents Whitfield, Danielle Howell. But also I got Imogen Heap up there to play before anybody knew who she was in 1998. And I'm always really proud about that. Where was I during September 11th? Got a call early in the morning from a friend in Alaska saying, Bern, a plane just flew into the World Trade Center. And I said, yeah. And I was thinking back to the plane that flew into the Empire State Building back in, I think it was the 40s or so. And I was thinking, okay. He goes like, it was a big plane. I said, okay. And he says like, and it seems like something's happening. So I woke up early. By the time I got up there, and the station was 5 minutes walk from my house. By the time I got there, I realized, this is really huge. So I just canceled all the programming for the day, and then the second plane struck, and then the Pentagon, and then the third plane went down. And it was September 11th, and we were just listening to, we were an NPR station, so we were listening to, report after report after report, update, just crazy. But I didn't see anything. I saw a couple of photos. At that time, the internet was still pretty primitive, and you didn't get good video. So it wasn't until about noon that I was taken over to someone's house to watch on television this stuff, and I was like, whoa! And I realized where it fell down, I was inside the exclusion zone. I would have been able to watch the whole thing from my roof. So I thought to myself, interesting that I'm not there now, but those are reflections for another time. I made new intellectual discoveries while I was up there. Baroque dance music, which sometime I'll share a little bit of why I find that so fascinating. The late 20th century classical composers, Paul Virilio's work, puppetry and puppet history, it's like, which I can tell you far more than you probably ever want to hear, but I've made videos about that if you're so inclined. Ballet got interesting to me, and then around the same time I got interested in ballet, a little bit later I got interested in the country of Georgia. And I remember I was sitting during the pandemic, but before we went into lockdown number 2, with a friend of mine, Mariam Darchia, who happens to be the principal dancer at the Georgi Alexidze ballet troupe. And I was telling her, it's just like, yeah, so I got interested in ballet, and then I got interested in the art of ballet, because I saw the connections with puppetry. And then I got interested in Georgia, and here I am. And we laughed because it was kind of like, it's just one of those things. It's just like, here I am talking to a ballerina in Georgia. I couldn't even have imagined such a thing when I first got interested in around 2012 in these things. But more importantly, I learned so many practical things in Georgia. I'm not in Georgia, in Alaska. One of the interesting things about being in Alaska is that the person on top of the hierarchy there is not creative types like me, not intellectual people. No one particular. I mean, people are like, yeah, there's that weird Bern guy who has all those records and books, which was a resource for people. But rather, it was the guy who could take apart his boat and repair it, take apart a plane and repair it, let alone taking apart a car. And, given my history, it was like, sometimes changing the oil on the car was like a mystery, which I eventually, learned how to do. But I mean, people there would build their own houses. They think nothing of it. It was like, so for me, that was really interesting. It was humbling because I realized, oh, wow, look at, these people can do something I can't even begin to do. And I remember this one guy named Tom. He was about 80 years old, and he had actually come to my music history class, and I'm playing him stuff like gangster rap and death metal and stuff by the time we're done, and he sits there going like, I don't know how you know all this stuff. You just know so much. And I said, Tom, you can literally rebuild a boat from scratch. I mean, he had in his yard, before he passed away, a boat he had literally welded in half, pulled the engine apart, and he used to do that with planes. and he was not the only one who could do that. It's just like, and I'm sitting there going like, I couldn't even, I can't even hardly get the key in in the ignition. You're that good. But one of the things I did learn there, and this started actually back at L'Abri in Switzerland, and then I started doing a little bit in New York City, was I started having special dinners. And I got better at this as time went on. So I would use things. One of the things I learned is if you want to have special dinners, vegetables aren't going to cut it. And I think for the same reason that vegetables weren't as good a sacrifice as the meat was in the Cain and Abel story. It's like you almost have to have the sacrifice of an animal to have a really joyous event. And I'm sorry to any vegans out there, but, that's just my observation. I've never seen, people can come together and laugh, but it's when you put the slab of meat that you've roasted on the table that's like, yeah, this kicks it up a notch. So, I had goose for people, duck, which was not a usual American type meals, but then things like moose or mountain goat or fresh salmon or fresh halibut, fresh halibut is like fish butter. It's just absolutely amazing. And I don't mean frozen. I mean drag it in off the dock, fresh. Or how about this, brown bear? I'm going to just leave that out there. Normally you're not supposed to eat brown bear, but I'm going to leave that out there as a mystery for you as to how that happened. Or the most bizarre of all, and I've got a picture of it somewhere here, a seal. We had a seal, which is illegal for folks who are not native to hunt for. But fortunately, I had friends who were they Yupiks or Inupiats? But the Eskimos on the coast, and they gave him a huge slab of seal meat. This was like purple black. It's a bizarre, funky taste, halfway between bear and fish. Anyway, I got to the point where people were saying, "Bern, when are we going to have another music night at your house?" Because sometimes I'd play music for people. I'd go like, "Yeah, let's listen to music from Georgia," and all these people in Alaska would love Georgian music. And if you meet anyone who's been in Alaska who likes Georgian music, chances are I'm behind it somewhere. It was around this time I started also watching a few series. I get them on DVDs, like The Walking Dead. Why do I keep watching The Walking Dead? Because I get committed to series. I'm not one of these people who starts thinking I'm superior to the series. My feeling is I want to watch this to the end. So, it's like I got all the X-Files episodes and watched them. Something to do in the long winters. And even though it tapers off at the end as far as the quality goes, so what? It's just like, it's interesting for me to see what they're doing. I'm interested in I'm interested when things go wrong as well as when things go right. And truthfully, with The Walking Dead, I'm glad I did persevere, because suddenly the quality went up again, in the last couple of seasons. So there, it's commitment. I have a real commitment to seeing things through, even when they're, so I'll get, I'll try to. It was one of the reasons I stopped collecting comic books, because I realized, I'm not going to, get to issue 1,000 on whatever comic book. That's just way too much time. So, how do I stay in touch with people? How did I stay in touch with people in Alaska? The internet started happening as soon as I got to Alaska. And from there, it's interesting. Once I hit Facebook, suddenly I hooked up with all these people I hadn't been able to contact in years. Is that a good thing? Sometimes it's a great thing. Other times, it's a terrible thing. It's great when you can connect, like my friend Dave Lewis back in New York City, and he's really into Asian pop music. And I happen to have a few Asian pop records he's really into. So it was nice to connect with him and just, get hints about the music and such like that. But then there are times when you see someone's life and you look at what they're up to now and you go like, oh, man, it's just not that good, And so you see both the good and the bad. Can you keep up with all the people? No. And nor do you want to. But at the same time, I like, but funny thing is, there are people from California from the Jesus People days that I still keep up with. There are people from New York, both the beginning and the end of my period there, that I still keep up with. There are people in Alaska, obviously, that I keep up with. There are all sorts of puppeteers that I keep up with. You know, the other night, my friends in Sicily that I met in 2017, Teatro de Pupi de Carlemagno, or something like that, the Charlemagne Theater. We're doing Sicilian puppets, and they invited me to watch them live, and so I did. I'm getting a frog in my throat because I'm talking too long. And I don't have any liquid here. Such is life. I'm almost done. So why did I move to Georgia? My life in Alaska was good, just like my life in New York City was good. Why did I move to Georgia? I could feel things in Alaska changing. And it wasn't like it was changing for the worse, but I could feel that I had done quite a few things there. I was working in tourism at the end, taking people on tours to float down the river or tours to see bears. That's a nice story right there. But I just got the feeling, plus there was this weird thing in me that was just like getting more and more interested in Georgia. I started collecting more videos of Georgians singing and dancing. I read, Georgians are always impressed when I tell them I read Shota Rustaveli's The Knight in Panther's Skin. It's their national epic poem. I got more interested in Georgia as a place because I could see that they were in an interesting zone right now. In a way, I've visited the Czech Republic many times, but the Czech Republic's moment of freedom seemed to have come and gone rather quickly and settled into this new thing. Whereas in Georgia, because they had a civil war in the 1990s and then a 5-day war with Russia in 2008, everything seemed delayed. But for me, that was interesting because it meant I could come here at a point where things were just opening up, but I could be a part of it. And that interested me, is to come here both to learn from the Georgians and to give maybe what I have to learn from the Georgians. When I someday get my full library here in Alaska, from Alaska to Georgia, my whole record collection basically deals with stuff that was never a part of their culture because they were locked inside the Soviet Union. So it becomes a resource, which is really important to me, is to be able to help people with all this stuff that's in my head. To get it out, it doesn't do any good on shelves. What does good is to take what you learn, boil it down, and find ways to share it with people. Around 2014, I went through a period where I was kind of just facing things. The teaching the students was pretty much over at that point. I was done with the radio station long ago. Tourism was, didn't get much sustenance out of that, although it could be quite interesting. And learning about nature was another thing that was so important, being in Alaska. I would go off into the woods and hunt mushrooms, listening for the sound of bears and moose. But, I thought to myself, how come I never got married? How come I don't have children? Do I regret that? Yeah, there's a point at which you say, how come? Do I think my life's over yet, though? No. So it's like, I learned back in New York City, or actually, when I first got to Alaska, I learned this. There's no point in being desperate about things. Being desperate about things creates the conditions of your own nightmares. When you start saying, oh my God, I'm not married yet. Oh my God, I don't have children. All of this, rather than seeing the good you have, rather than continuing to give to other people, it all becomes about your needs. And I learned at a certain point, it can't be about my needs. It's not, yeah, sure, I would love to meet the right person, fall in love. Who knows? I'm not totally out of the children game. I got a lot of life in me yet, so I'm good. Things are pretty good for me here. But the point is, I'm not thinking about it one way or another. I'm just simply living and seeing what the day brings. Because that is what we're told to do in the Bible, and I live that way. It's not about trying to, I think about the future a lot too, but not in the sort of way, I don't get worried about the future. Worry does nothing. It strangles the ability to act. And I said to myself, how come I had finished one novel around 2004. I had written a 400-page rough draft. How come I don't have any of this published? I was thinking, did I really do much good with the homeschooling? And to this day, I can't answer that as a positive yes. I wish I could. I wish I could say, yeah, it all worked out. But no, I see lots of ways in which maybe it didn't work as well as I was hoping. But I went through this and I came to the point where I said, well, maybe most of what I'm doing will not be understood until I'm dead. Fine. Someone will find something, or maybe not. Maybe it'll all get buried or thrown away or burnt or something. Like maybe all my stuff in Alaska right now, I'll die here and no one will know what to do with it. And so, poof, it just, that's life. Sometimes you think about the stories of people. Sometimes all you know about them is one little detail. Think about, stories in history, stories. It's we're not going to leave a lot of records. The only thing you can leave is your relationships to people now. How you affect people. Does it make a difference? These videos seem to help someone. And so I do them. And I get something out of that. And as Paul Vanderklay said, I got to get stuff out of my head. I got a lot in there. Most of you haven't seen the beginning of it. Believe it or not. So one of the things I'd always said to myself is, I knew my mother, she was about 80 years old, but I knew she was getting older. And I said to myself, maybe I'll go to Georgia someday after her passing. Well, she did die. And she died in 2015. And fortunately, I went through the moment in 2014 where I had to face my own shortcomings. And it was not a pleasant moment. It was not a pleasant moment at all. And yet, I willingly went through it. And that's the thing. People have sometimes asked, and I was asked here, how do you go through the dark stuff? Willingly. Number one. There's no hiding from it. If you think you can hide and, it's like a lot of people, it's just like someone breaks up in a relationship and they tell you, you should go find someone new who really cares for you. It's not going to be good. Not until you face it, what your problem is, what's going wrong. So, my mother died. She passed me a little money. It would be hardly considered much at all. But enough that I was able to get back on the road and do more with my gravity from above research. And so I went through Europe again to puppet theaters, but then I went to Georgia for 3 weeks in 2016, and I thought, wow, and this hit me like, whatever, I had read a lot. I would not be like most of you would be if you came to Georgia. You'd be like, have probably done not even a smidgen of the research I had done, because that's just me. And I still was just like, what a different world. But I really liked it. I really liked it here. And I really liked, I was meeting all sorts of interesting people, dancers and musicians and artists, puppeteers, So I thought, it's interesting. I wasn't thinking of living here. And then I went back to Alaska. Oh, one of the big things that happened during this period, I went back to Alaska. In 2017, the people who owned my house decided to sell it. To make a long story short, the house is no longer there, physically. And I was living in this really cool old Quonset hut. So and I was getting a very good deal on it all along, which is why I never
thought about buying anything, which is probably for the better. So I put everything into storage. And I won't tell you about everything that went into the process of, I mean, it was just one of the hardest things I ever did was putting everything into storage and then getting ready to go on this trip. But one of the things that happened was I said to myself, well, I can start looking for a new place to live. It's going to be more expensive. I'm probably going to have to buckle down and get some more work. My schedule was pretty interesting. I'd work during the summer and then try to get back to Europe to do some research and then kind of coast through the rest of the winter. But I realized, I could go visit Switzerland. I have friends in Paris. I have friends in Brussels, Belgium, puppeteer friends. And I realized, I almost have 3 months worth of places to visit that wouldn't cost me hardly anything. And then I saw that a friend of mine in Georgia that I'd met was putting up her house on Airbnb, and it was like $20 a night. And I thought, 6 months. I got it right there. So I decided to go away for 6 months. So all my stuff is in storage. I go away for 6 months. And when I came here, I spent 3 months in Georgia. And I was starting to think, like, I could see myself living here. And it was just something about the attitude of the Georgians and such. Are the children interested in religion? Well, the children are interested in a lot of things here. The youth are. I think they're some of the smartest students I've ever run into. Not smart like quantitatively, but smart as in curious, open, willing to talk about stuff. It's that. Are they religious? Some very much so, some not so much so. And as I mentioned, you should go watch. Connected to this, I'm trying not to overlap too much. Paul Vanderklay and I just had a conversation that dealt with a lot of things also that were personal. If you put this together with that, you'll get a broader picture. But no, and then I got offered a job at helping to build a puppet museum. How could I say no? It sounded great. So I went back to Alaska, worked throughout the summer, occupying no fixed abode, saving up as much money as I possibly could. And then I came back, did some more puppetry research for 3 months in Europe, and then came here in December 15th. I just, in fact, passed my 2-year anniversary here. And there was a French institute that was supposed to give me money to help me with my documentary, Gravity from Above. That didn't come through. And then the job was supposed to be something that it didn't turn into at all, and I got paid microscopically. I mean, well, let's put it to you this way. What I would earn in a day in Alaska is what I earned in a month here. Which meant my finances collapsed very quickly as I was paying for things and trying to stay afloat. But I decided to go ahead and get my Social Security money early before I reached the age of, it's 66 now and I'm 65, so I did it. Then I said, I should have done this at 62. I would have had an extra $20,000 or whatever by this time. Whatever. But anyway, so now I'm afloat. It's not on much money, but the nice thing is I don't need that much money here. And because I was working for a while for this institute, or these museums, I managed to get a residence visa. And so I'm here. And life is good. I talked a bit about orthodoxy on the Paul Vanderklay video, so I'll refer you to that. And to which I'll say, it really interests me, and there are a few theological things I can't quite get around yet. We'll see. I have some dear Orthodox friends here who are really hoping that I become Orthodox. And my feeling is like, as long as you realize I've been a Christian for quite a while, like 50 years, I'm fine. How long will I stay here? Who knows? Till I die is my guess at the moment. But hey, you never know what will happen. The biggest thing that needs to happen is I need to get my stuff here. I just paid another year's rent on my storage unit back in Alaska. And so by next October, when I owe the money again, I will have enough money to bring it here. But the problem is I don't have a here to bring it to. And I need to buy a house before then, which fortunately isn't going to cost a lot of money. I mean, I could put $5,000 to $10,000 down here and pay it off within 7 years. But I don't have that much yet, and I'm going to have to figure out something. I was going to put a kind of a GoFundMe crowdfunder up by now. And then very recently, my town, Haines in Alaska, just went through a complete catastrophe where part of a mountain slid down the hill and all sorts of other flooding and stuff. I mean, the town, combined with having no economy for the year, basically, has been ruined. And I feel so bad that I just can't put a crowdfunder out, at least not for the next few months. I just don't want to take away from that. But eventually I will have to, and I will try to, and you'll get a chance to contribute. So anyway, I'm trying to think if there's anyone's question I didn't quite get to here. What's my church life like in Georgia? I do go to the Orthodox Church as a visitor every now and then. It's and I really appreciate it. Like I say, there is the language to consider. So I'm going to have to learn more Georgian, which I should do. And I'm learning far more interesting things here. I've gotten more interested in Georgian art and culture and folk tales and stuff. I'm coming up with an idea for a short film, kind of a folk horror film set in the mountains here. I'm still exploring things here. I've been so chained to doing these videos, guys. I'm doing this for you. It's all for you. Why don't you appreciate it? Actually, you guys appreciate it far more than I have any right to expect. But, you know, the truth is, if you've gotten this far in the video, and if you're watching this video, chances are you're not, I don't need to tell you to subscribe, you're already a subscriber. I just want to thank you for asking all these really personal and questions. I hope I've given you some sort of answer. I feel, like I say, I was just skimming across the surface. At any point, you can drop the rock down and it goes a long way. So whether it's the early 1970s, the time at L'Abri in Switzerland, you know, my troubled times in New York City, my kind of glorious times in New York City, life at the radio station in Alaska, you know, traveling around doing puppetry, investigating puppeteers in Europe, and being here in Georgia and all the interesting people I've met here and all sorts of different types. It's all, to me, it's all very humbling to know that's all part of my life. And some people, like I said, they get like a bit like, what can we do? Well, what you have to do is live. And how you have to live is, of course, I can't tell you what your journey in life is. But you've got one. And whether it's a small circle or a wide one, it doesn't matter. It's all pretty interesting. I mean, I lived in Alaska in a community of 2,500 people for 22 years. Ultra fascinating. People in New York City used to say, well, what are you going to do there? To which I realized they meant, what kind of media are you going to consume there? To which I'm going like, you have no idea. It's just like when I hear people talking about, yeah, what if the world's a big simulation? I just want to grab them by the scruff of the neck, their collar, drag them out up Chilkoot River corridor about 10 o'clock at night in the summer and tell them there's like 6 bears down there. I'll be back for you tomorrow. And it's just like, all talk about simulation will go out of your head in a second. All talk about, well, what's real for you is real for you. How do we know what reality is? I'm going like, man, spend time with a bear. It will change your mind because you will realize it isn't your reality. You're not on the top of the food chain here. You know, you have to adjust to it. which is the way we should understand about all of life. It's not about us. It's about how we interact with everything else. So there is meaning, to me, in everything. There's meaning in the catastrophes. There's meaning in the failures. There's also, if you're open to it, there will be times that come along in your life when everything stands out as in such a memorable way. And the only way to be ready for that is to be open to it. And then when it comes, don't hold on to it. Not that you just let go. I hate that expression. Just let go. And sometimes, no, you got to hold on with your teeth, But, no, what I mean is that you can't expect one moment to remain that moment. I can't expect, when I go back to Libri, Switzerland, like the last time I did it was in 2018, I can't expect it to be like it was in 1978 and 1980. Hardly at all. And yet, I see the continuities, and that's what makes it real. That's what makes it moving. That's what makes it truthful. And that's what it's about. It's about living in time. And one of the reasons I was willing to share a bit about myself is because I want to let you folks know that you need to think about your own life and think about the history of your life and how you got here. What's influencing you? I haven't done that good a job of telling you much about me. Because like I say, I know what's missing. What's missing is massive. If this is an iceberg, this is just the top of the outside of the iceberg. That's all I've been able to give you, just a little bit of the tippy corner. But that's how it is for all of us. Our lives are fractals. They go on and on. They touch so many. Okay, well, I'm going to call it quits. I'm sure there's some things I missed, and I'm sorry if I didn't fully answer your question. But I've tried to organize this in some way. This is probably much too long. Why am I talking about myself so long? Okay. Let's get out of here.
A people without history is not redeemed from time. For history is a pattern of timeless moments.